It's 12:30 a.m., June 6, 1944. Major Werner Pluskat is asleep near his command post, a few miles inland from a stretch of French coastline the Allies have secretly codenamed Omaha Beach. He's in charge of an artillery battalion, part of the German 352nd Infantry Division. Aircraft engines drone overhead in the dark. He assumes it's just another routine air raid. The kind that's happened plenty of nights before. He picks up the phone and calls his regimental commander, a man named Ocker, just to check. Ocker tells him it's probably nothing. Pluskat goes back to sleep. The phone rings again a short while later. This time, the news is different. Paratroopers, landing inland, cutting roads, seizing bridges. Something bigger is happening. Pluskat and two of his officers jump into a car and drive about 4 miles through the darkness to reach his forward observation bunker, built into the cliffs above a village called Saint-Honorine. That bunker happens to sit right at the eastern edge of the beach the Allies are about to land on. As the sky begins to lighten, Pluskat looks out across the water. And according to the story he told for the rest of his life, this is the moment everything changes. He sees the fleet. Not a few ships, not dozens, thousands of them, stretching across the entire horizon as far as he can see. An invasion force bigger than anything he could have imagined. He would later say this was the exact moment he understood with total certainty that Germany had already lost the war. That single image, one man, alone in a cliffside bunker at dawn, watching an impossible number of ships appear out of the mist, became one of the most famous German perspective moments of D-Day anywhere in popular history. It's the emotional centerpiece of Cornelius Ryan's famous 1959 book, The Longest Day. It's a signature scene in the big 1962 movie based on that book, and Pluskat himself actually worked as a consultant on that film, helping shape how the scene was shown. In 1964, 20 years after the invasion, he appeared on French television and told the story again in his own words, saying he had stood in that exact spot as the very first German officer to see the Allied fleet approaching.
Here's where it's worth slowing down, though, because this is the part where the popular story and the actual historical record start to disagree with each other. Pluskat wasn't the only German officer who later claimed to be the first to spot the fleet. Another officer, a man named Walter Ohmsen, who commanded a different artillery battery further along the coast, is also credited in some accounts with being the one who spotted the ships first, using his battery's own rangefinder equipment. More importantly, a German machine gunner named Heinz Severloh, a soldier who was actually dug into a fighting position on Omaha Beach itself that morning, not watching safely from a cliff, but right down at the water's edge, wrote his own memoir many years later. In that book, he said plainly that Pluskat wasn't even with his unit on the day of the invasion. He said the movie's version of events wasn't truthful. He said other German soldiers on the beach that day couldn't find Pluskat when they needed orders from him. Some historians who've looked into this more closely have gone even further. They point out that Pluskat's famous dawn sighting isn't backed up by any surviving German military paperwork from that day. No radio message, no written report, nothing from June 6, 1944 itself that confirms the moment happened the way he described it years later. What actually exists is Pluskat's own account, told first to a journalist writing a best-selling book more than a decade after the war, then dramatized for a Hollywood film, then repeated by Pluskat himself on camera 20 years after the invasion. That's not the same thing as proof. It's one man's memory, told and retold, becoming the accepted version simply because it was the version that got written down, filmed, and repeated the most. That doesn't mean Pluskat is lying, or that none of this happened. It just means we should be honest about the difference between "this is documented fact" and "this is what one man said happened, and nobody was able to prove or disprove it afterward." What is in dispute, and what doesn't depend on anyone's personal memory, is what happened to his unit once the actual battle began. His artillery guns really did fire that morning. His battalion really did fight.
Moving forward! The left flank is collapsing. Move it! Get off the boat! Keep moving forward! Don't stop! Stay with us, buddy! Keep your eyes open!
Omaha Beach ended up being, by almost every historical account, the single toughest stretch of coastline the Germans defended anywhere on D-Day, and it also produced the worst American casualties of any landing beach that day. But no amount of resistance was ever going to be enough against what was coming at them. Allied battleships and cruisers offshore poured a huge, overwhelming amount of naval gunfire onto the German positions, and spotters on the beach and in the air kept adjusting that fire, walking it closer and closer to the German guns with frightening accuracy. Ammunition started running low. Radio communication between positions began breaking down completely. Meanwhile, American soldiers pinned down at the base of the bluffs started working their way up through narrow gaps in the terrain called draws, using grenades and demolition charges to knock out one German strongpoint after another. By the middle of the morning, the German defensive line above Omaha Beach had been broken. A stretch of coastline that had been one of the most heavily fortified parts of the entire Atlantic Wall had turned within a few hours into a foothold the Allies could build on. Pluskat lived through the battle. He lived through the rest of the war, too. Later on, he was present when a German general, Kurt Dittmar, surrendered to soldiers from the American 30th Infantry Division. Pluskat himself didn't die until 2002, and for decades after the war, he became the go-to German witness whenever journalists or filmmakers wanted a first-hand account of what D-Day looked like from the other side of the beach. That's exactly why his version of the story became the version most people ended up hearing. He was available, he was willing to talk, and his story was dramatic enough to make it into a famous book and a famous film, while soldiers like Severlo, who were actually down on the sand fighting that morning, didn't get their version told to the world until decades later, if at all.